Hello and welcome to my channel, the ABCD of Intensive Care Medicine. In this channel, I am going to attempt to simplify the basics of intensive care medicine in a series of short videos covering each topic in a subseries. So in the first series, we are going to attempt to learn the thing in the ICU that has confused us all for a long time, and that is the ventilator. In this first video, we are going to revise certain basics of ventilation. So what is this ventilator? Well, simply put, ventilator is a machine which aids or replaces the patient's ventilatory efforts. So then what is ventilation? Ventilation is basically the movement of air from the atmosphere to the alveoli and then back. Now for this movement to occur, say from a point A to point B, there has to be a pressure difference between these 2 points. And the first part of this video attempts to understand these pressures that are developed in a normal spontaneous ventilation. But before we get there, let us understand the basic difference between ventilation and respiration. Ventilation, as I said, is the movement of air, and it takes place in 4 phases: the inspiration, the inspiratory hold, the expiration, and the expiratory hold. Respiration, on the other hand, is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between an organism and the environment. In humans, it is divided in 2 phases. External respiration, in which oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, and internal respiration, which occurs at a cellular level, wherein oxygen from the blood moves in the cells and carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of the aerobic metabolism, is let out in the blood. In this video, in the later part, we'll also have a look at the process of external respiration, while that of internal respiration we will cover in a later video. So now let's start with the mechanics of ventilation. So let's say that this is the upper respiratory tract, the body surface, the chest wall, the diaphragm, the parietal pleura, the pleural fluid, the visceral pleura, the lungs, and finally the alveoli. The first pressure which we see is the airway opening pressure or the mouth pressure. This is the pressure exerted on the mouth by the air. At sea level, it is 1 atmospheric pressures or 760 millimeters of mercury. We usually denote it as 0. A similar pressure is exerted on our body surface again by the air, and this is similar to the airway pressure at 1 atmospheric pressure or 760 millimeters of mercury. The third pressure which we see is the intrapleural pressure. To understand how this pressure is generated, let us first have a look at the structure of the pleura and its relation to the pleural fluid and the chest wall and the lungs. The chest wall, as we all know, has a basic tendency to move outwards, while the lungs have a basic tendency to collapse inwards. This causes a stretch on the 2 layers of the pleura which are attached to the chest wall and the lungs, thus creating a tension in the pleural fluid. And this is what generates the intrapleural pressure, which is about minus 5 centimeters of water at the end of expiration as compared to the atmosphere, while it raises to about minus 10 centimeters of water at the end of a normal inspiration. The next and the last pressure which comes in play is the alveolar pressure, also known as the lung pressure or the intrapulmonary pressure. This is due to the stretching of the lungs, as we just saw now, and this pressure is transmitted to the lung parenchyma, thus to the alveoli, hence creating a pressure of about 1 centimeters of water at the end of expiration as compared to the atmospheric pressure, which goes down to about minus 1 centimeter of water at the end of inspiration. So now these 4 pressures are the static pressures. Let's see how these pressures create a gradient across themselves to create a movement of the air. The first gradient which we see is the trans-airway pressure. This is the pressure difference between the pressure at the airway opening and the alveolar pressure, and this is the pressure which is utilized to overcome the airway resistance. The next gradient that we see is the trans-thoracic pressure. This is the pressure difference between the pressure at the body surface and the alveolar pressure, and this is the gradient utilized to overcome the elastic recoil of the lungs and the chest wall. The next gradient is the transpulmonary or transalveolar pressure. This is the pressure difference between the alveolar pressure and the intrapleural pressure, and this is the pressure which is utilized for alveolar inflation, hence also called as the alveolar distending pressure. The last gradient that you are going to see is the respiratory pressure. This is the pressure difference between the airway opening and the body surface area. This pressure is a combination of the thoracic pressure and the airway pressure, and is the pressure required to inflate the lungs and the airways during a positive pressure ventilation. So let's see what happens during a normal spontaneous breath. During inspiration, the muscles of the chest wall contract, thus pulling out the chest wall and the diaphragm out and down. This pulls the visceral pleura with it and thus increases the negative intrapleural pressure, which is then transmitted to the parietal pleura and thus to the lungs and the alveoli, hence causing the inflation of the alveoli, reducing the pressure between the airway opening and the alveolus to a further of -3 to -5 centimeters of water, and thus creating a flow of air from the mouth to the alveoli. Once the pressure difference becomes 0, the flow of air stops and the inspiration ends. Here the chest muscles and the diaphragm stop contracting, and due to the elastic recoil of the lungs, which have a tendency to collapse, the intrapleural pressure starts becoming progressively positive, thus deflating the alveoli and forcing the air back to the atmosphere. So now these were the basic mechanics of ventilation. Now let us understand what happens to the air that we inhale. But before that, what is this air and what is its composition? Air, as we all know from our basic teaching, is composed of 78% of nitrogen, 21% of oxygen, 0.9% of inert gases, and just 0.04% of carbon dioxide. If we convert these values to fractions, it comes down to 0.78 of nitrogen, 0.21 of oxygen, 0.009 of inert gases, and only 0.0004 of carbon dioxide. And this concept or these values are known as the fraction of the inspired gases. The second concept to understand here is that, as we saw previously, this air is exerting a pressure of about 1 atmosphere or 760 millimeters of mercury on the body surface and the airway opening. This means that all these components in total are exerting a pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. So if we want to find out how much is the pressure exerted by the individual components, we will just have to multiply their fraction in the air by the total pressure. So this gives us a value of about 593 millimeters of mercury for nitrogen and about 160 millimeters of mercury for oxygen. And this here is the concept of the partial pressure of the inspired gases. Now as this air moves through the upper airway, there is an addition of carbon dioxide and water to this. And the final composition of air that reaches the alveolus is nitrogen at 75%, oxygen at 14%, water at 6%, and carbon dioxide at 5%. Thus, the partial pressure are 569 millimeters of mercury for nitrogen, 104 millimeters of mercury for oxygen, 46 millimeters of mercury for water vapor, and 40 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide. And these here are the values for the partial pressure of gases in the alveoli. So, the P small aO2 is 104 millimeters, while the P small a CO2 is 40 millimeters. Now here comes the blood vessel surrounding the alveolus, coming in as the pulmonary artery and going off as the pulmonary vein. The partial pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary artery is 40 millimeters of mercury, while that of carbon dioxide is 46 millimeters of mercury. As this blood passes through the vessel in close proximity to the alveolus, there is an exchange of gases with oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide coming out from the blood. This movement, known as diffusion, is dependent on a variety of factors like the thickness of the alveolar wall, the pulmonary capillary and the presence or absence of fluid or other substances in between these two, the pressure difference of the gas between the two layers, and the solubility of gas across the layer. So here, though the pressure difference for carbon dioxide is only 6 mm as compared to about 60 for that of oxygen, carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble in the body membranes as compared to oxygen. Hence, the rate of diffusion for both is almost the same. So after this exchange, the blood leaving via the pulmonary veins now has the oxygen at a partial pressure of 100 mm of mercury and carbon dioxide at a pressure of about 40 mm of mercury. And this was the complete process of external respiration. Here I'll end my first video, in which we have tried to revise the very basic concepts of ventilation, the basic nomenclatures of the pressures, so that when we move ahead, we are in the clear. Please like and subscribe to my channel and click on the bell icon so that you are kept abreast of any new videos which I will post. See you all in my next video, which will cover the pulmonary function tests. Thank you.